Oh, thank you. Is that better? Do you need that? Okay. So a recognition of what we are and what we are not. So we are people, just full-on three-dimensional people like everyone else. Disability doesn't mean that we're sick or that, oh, was that you? Come see about me. Yeah, it was awesome.
Making sure that we were testing audio before you guys.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. And does everyone know Kirti?
Hello.
This is Kirti. We'll put her on the spot. People with disabilities aren't necessarily sick or in pain. People can have a disability and be healthy, happy, active, fully fleshed out people. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, that a medical diagnosis may not be part, I mean, certainly at some point there was some medical diagnosis that went along with forming our identity, but that doesn't necessarily be part of it all the time. Like, okay, I have a spinal cord injury. I don't see a doctor on a regular basis. I don't take any medications, anything like that. So because I have a disability doesn't mean that I'm sick. All right, and so that's one of the first things that I want to make sure we get across. We're going to talk about pre-production and that kind of stuff. Go ahead, Loren.
I think if I could reiterate that in a way, it would be that that's the last thing I really want you to think about me or to immediately describe me as like, oh, look for the guy in the wheelchair, he'll be coming by. Or it's so old. If you could just move on to saying anything else, that would be great.
That's awesome. So when you're talking about disability,
Like, let's just say you want to do a story on disability, right?
right,
Where do we start?
where do we start? So where do you start, Kirti? By the way, Kirti is editing the first quarterly magazine. Well, it's our
14th.
14th, but it's her first time editing the quarterly magazine. So, yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So take it, Kirti. And she is a Cronkite student. Yes. Yeah. Oh, ow! Those lumberjacks. And like they can put all the letters in the right order too.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
So first, I think when you think of a story, you want to think about whether or not, what disability is in the macro context of the story. What role does the person's disability play in the story? If you were at the last panel, you know, we talked a little bit about the cop who helped like a wheelchair-bound woman walk home. Was the wheelchair necessary in the context of the story? So you really want to think about things like that. Do you guys have any examples?
No, nothing specific that comes to mind, but I think that one of the bigger issues is that, you know, I want you to think about places where disability isn't already in your storytelling. Like, for example, if you do any kind of data reporting, overall, like, employment numbers come out, and you'll do a story and you'll talk about, you know, whether they're up or whether they're down, and how it impacts women, and how it impacts Latinos, and how it impacts this socioeconomic group, you know, people with college educations or people without or whatever it might be. But what I want you to notice when you look at those numbers, and many times when you see numbers or data packages come out, that when it starts breaking down demographics, disability is most often missing from those numbers. And why is that? And so you're missing an important part of the story. We were talking about economics earlier, and with Abby's group, and one of the things that I think people don't know, for example, do you know that people with disabilities represent 16 billion T&E dollars every single year? Yes, ma'am?
This sounds kind of silly, but what is the actual definition of the term disability?
Ooh.
Panel?
It's growing.
Yeah. Continually. So the definition of disability is a condition that causes one to have limitations in one of, it used to be 5 areas of living: mobility, cognition, independent living, sensory. What am I missing? I'm missing something. Anybody know which one I'm missing? Mobility, cognition, independent living, sensory. I'm missing something, but but it grows. It grows. So, you know, I think putting a label on it is hard. You know, if your daily life is impacted by your health issue, I suppose, then most likely you have a disability.
I mean, I think we see that now with people who have allergies. You know, probably 20 years ago that wasn't considered a disability, but now because it may impact your ability to be in a work environment, it's been classified as a disability to a certain extent.
Yeah.
It affects your ability to
Right.
or be at home.
Right.
A really common one that people don't normally think of as a disability, but they use adaptive equipment for it all the time, are glasses. Without your glasses, some people can't see at all. And so they use that adaptive technology to then see things and be able
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean that's adaptive technology certainly. But we are kind of getting a little far afield. Let's get back to where we were. In terms of creating a story, where does disability come into play?
So I guess it depends on what kind of story you're doing. If you're doing a data story or just a general story, you might want to think about how does this story or the effects of this new legislation, how does it impact a very specific population? And how can we get that perspective in there? A lot of people might not think about how some of the construction around here impacts how people with disabilities get to move around. What happens if the light rail is packed and the two spaces where people get on, they can't go? What happens if the two spots on the bus that are already filled with people with disabilities, can the third person not get on? Do they have to wait for the next one?
Yes, you do.
Yeah,
And usually you have to wait for one after that one too.
because the one that's just not in service and it just goes by. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sorry, Kirti, I interrupted you. Keep going.
Oh, no, but yeah, basically you want to think like a little bit about what can I do right now that maybe someone else maybe can't, and why can't they? And I think that those are just some important questions to ask when you're starting to think about how do I want to write a disability story.
Okay. All right. So now we've decided that we have a story and disability is going to be part of it,
Yeah.
right? And so now, if you're going to do a story, you need characters, right? So what is important in terms of doing an interview with a person with a disability?
Well, for sure, I think it starts with some research, understanding, you know, what is their disability, and a lot of times you can get better questions by knowing the exact disability. So, for example, if you find that a person has MS, well, there's going to be an MS society or an MS organization, and that's not the same as MD. And if you understand that multiple sclerosis and MD are different, walking into it being prepared is certainly a good way to start that conversation about
Wait,
the
not
disability.
every wheelchair user has exactly the same condition?
It's so interesting that that's the assumption. Yeah.
Okay. All right, I'm better now. I'm the cynical one, guys. Okay.
So doing a little background on the actual disability is probably the first one. And if you don't know it, then I would say that's probably one of the first questions that we ask. Are you comfortable? Like, I like it, if I'm doing the interview or if somebody's asking me, my first question is, are you comfortable talking about your disability? And that's more than likely they're going to say yes, but I think the body language is going to tell you how comfortable they are talking about it. Is it just a glancing question, or is it a deep dive into it? And a lot of times, just by giving you permission is a good way to be comfortable with starting the questions.
You have a question?
Can it be like exasperating for the interviewer to come in and just ask the interviewee to ask them to tell them about their disability? Is that
Right. Well, I think it depends on. So the question is it okay for the interviewer to ask the person to tell them about your disability? Yeah, I mean that's great. And like when I do an interview, I certainly try and make sure that I have some understanding of who I'm talking to and why, and you know how it's pertinent. But then, yeah, asking them those questions. Tell me more. So a question that I always ask, and we write a magazine, a lifestyle magazine specific for a disability community audience. And so disability is part of every story that we do. We do a travel story, we talk about accessibility. We do a sports story, there's a disability angle to every story we do. So, if I were interviewing you, I would tell you, the nature of my story and why your disability is important to my story. And I want you to do that to me too. Why is my disability going to be important in your story? Might be immediately obvious, right? I'm interviewing victims of gun violence who, have a long-term impact because of it, right? I'm your girl, right? By the way, I'm paralyzed as a result of gun violence, so it's cost me a lot of money. I ask people, so how do you characterize your disability? How are you comfortable with me characterizing your disability in my story? If I say these words, are you okay with it? And I'll tell you that there was one time that we didn't do that well. And we all thought we knew the story. It was a person that we all knew, considered a friend. We were writing about this world-class athlete that we all know. We know the story backwards and forwards. Someone else wrote it for us. And I should have probably been a better editor. And we mischaracterized this person's disability in a way that they found harmful, disrespectful maybe.
I think they were annoyed that Jen and I, obviously having disabilities, didn't get it right. And what was really frustrating was that we speculated that she was going to win the gold medal, and we were right. And we wrote the story, and if we had gotten it really right, it would have been great. But the fact that we got a portion of the disability wrong, we immediately had to downplay the whole story, and it was tough. I bought her coffee and apologized profusely, but it didn't change that we got it wrong.
The nature of her disability, and since as an athlete of that caliber, how her disability is characterized influences her, like her class or
right.
specification.
So she has an amputation, and so, amputees are always watching other amputees to see if they're in the right class and to make sure that they're competing with the same people. And by having one article out there that implied that maybe her disability is less or more, exposed her to that criticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah. That's what I want you to hear. Listen,
4 years ago.
We do this, all right? We live and breathe this stuff, and we can get it wrong. So we know that, well-meaning, well-researched, good-intentioned people can make mistakes. So don't be that afraid of us. I mean, you make mistakes now, right? Is there anyone here who's never had to correct an article or write a retraction of any kind? I was going to say, right?
But
yeah.
You asked it as, I forget the word you said. Was it, you said in terms of going into an interview, can you exasperate it? I think another one that's worse is when I feel that you trivialize it, and that the one is like, oh, I know how you feel because when I was pregnant, I had to roll out to the curb in a wheelchair. And I think they're just nervous, and they're trying to break the ice, and they say it in one way, and then they're off to asking the questions, and I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. How quick can I get out of this one?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but in those moments, do you stop and say, here's what you just did?
So I'm gonna.
Okay.
So it depends on which hat we're currently wearing, because doing the job that we do, sometimes we're PIOs, right? We're doing PR. If I'm doing that and I'm representing someone, I'm going to pull you aside and tell you about it. If I'm the subject of your article, you know, maybe I'm not. I'm going to, you know, later on tell my friends what a jerk you were, right? But isn't that what your subjects do anyhow? Now, many of you in this room are people that I now know. So, like, Amy and I have a long-term relationship. Mary and I have a relationship. If one of you did something, I'd be like, come here, I want to tell you all about that, right? I want to give you some feedback. So, I don't know that we're always comfortable doing that. And when someone gets your identity wrong, because this is my identity, this is who I, not what I am, and it is what I am. It's what I am, it's who I am, it's my cellular being. When you get it wrong, it can be bruising. And depending on, you know, what mood I'm in, what space we're in terms of that moment, I may or may not be willing to address it with you. It's very vulnerable. It's vulnerable to give an interview, right? But to give an interview, especially where my identity is on display, and especially in a world that I know so often gets it wrong, it can be hard. Now, because of the advocacy work I do, I work really hard to make sure you get it right. If you ever interview me, I'm tough, because I'm like, have you done this? Have you done this? I want to know that you're using these words, because I feel like I carry the weight of my community, and it's up to me to teach you and to not give you any slack when you get it wrong in terms of disability reporting. You had something?
I'll answer it a little bit different. The answer is no, probably not. I'm not going to really take that too deep. I'm going to focus more on making sure you get a good interview out of me that hopefully enlightens the writer that, oh, maybe I didn't. But, you know, who knows? Exactly. Yeah, Kirthi, go.
Right, so the interview, so, you know, you've done your research, you've decided what the macro context of the story is, how disability plays into it, and you found some people to interview. Now you're going to interview them. The first thing you want to do is, if they're with a caretaker, which is pretty normal, please don't talk to the caretaker. Please talk to them directly. You guys can speak more about that, but it is a little bit disrespectful.
Yeah, so, you know, a way that happens to me is if I'm out to dinner with a friend, for example. Is there anyone in this room that doubts that I can clearly voice my needs? All right, thank you, I appreciate that. It's not that funny.
She's saying
Right,
clearly.
right. But, you know, if I'm sitting in a restaurant, a server will come up and say, and what's she having? And for her, right? People won't put change in my hands. People assume that if you're standing beside me, you're responsible for me. Now, I drive, I live alone, I work. I do a lot of things. But I can't tell you how many times I hear some version of, and I'll use it this way, who brung you? Right? I mean, I hear that all the time. And oftentimes in those words, and I'm like, first off, can we talk about grammar? And then second, now we'll delve into the issue. But people, again, it goes back to that assumption that we're weak and we're incapable, and we're not. So
I think
I see a question over here, and I saw something pop up here. So I'm going to let Kirthi, and then I'm going to go here, and I'm going to come back to Nicole. Go ahead, Kirthi.
actually no, she can go ahead because I was about to segue into something else.
Okay, go ahead.
So when it comes to interviewing, so back in college, I did a story where the person I was interviewing was deaf, and they're speaking through a translator. And so how I had to work, how that publication had me word it was speaking through, oh, it's not translator, interpreter, my apologies. Speaking through her interpreter, so-and-so said. Looking back, I'm not sure if that was correct or not. And then also one hurdle that we ran into was, you know, especially when you're freelance, you don't make much per story.
Mm-hmm.
But
Tell me about it.
yeah, the interpreter needed to be paid, so they actually billed the publication, and the publication paid them, but was also surprised because it was also something that publication had ran into before. So we weren't sure exactly. I mean, this is like a decade ago, so it might be different now, but how, I don't know if there's maybe better tips that people who have been in that situation
So did you mean you were talking to the interpreter with the, sorry.
The source was deaf.
Uh-huh.
Right.
And so, in order for the story, I had to put, instead of just saying, so and
Oh,
so said,
okay.
I had to in the story somehow work in through a interpreter the so and so said, and then for the rest of the story, I was able to use quotes as if they were speaking, but I had to put in the story there was an interpreter.
So maybe mentioning that an interpreter was present is germane, but the person was speaking. And I'm not taking issue with you, so please don't hear that. But, if a person uses a sign language interpreter, they are still speaking. They're directly communicating with you through their interpreter. Or if they're using a sound device, I mean, it might be an interesting aspect of the story. So-and-so communicates with the use of a soundboard. And our conversation included blah, 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 blah. So-and-so, and then in terms of the cost of the interpreter, yeah, I mean, I don't know who else would have paid for it. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I would think that if you wanted to interview someone, I mean, the cost of what it takes for you to get your interview or the cost of what it takes to get your interview, right? So if you need an interpreter in order to do it, that's on your publication, yeah. That's what I would think, yeah. Right, yeah, like paying for documents, yeah. Okay, we gotta keep moving here, okay? Oh, and Nicole, go ahead. I'm sorry, Nicole.
We had the question that was at the end of my segment, which was how to approach someone who's nonverbal and let them have a voice in the story. Maybe we can answer that question in one more, just to stay on time.
Right. So how would you communicate with someone who's nonverbal? They have a communication method, whether it's a touch board, whether it is, nonverbal is ambiguous. There are folks that are called nonverbal who communicate verbally, but I can't understand their words, and there's another person there who does. And then interprets the same way it might be if they spoke French or, something else that I don't speak. So whether they're using a soundboard, a touch board, or an interpreter, if you're communicating, and maybe they communicate strictly by writing, you found them somehow, and you've communicated that you'd like to interview them. So they have some means of communication, whatever that is, you're going to honor their means of communication. Is that pretty clear? Amy's got a question, go ahead.
What if it's someone with an intellectual disability? Or
Oh, if it's a child, I think generally you would ask a
Right,
parent.
so, yeah,
No
a
matter what.
person with an intellectual disability, now that becomes a very interesting question, doesn't it? Because, at what point, how old are they? An adult, all right, so at what point are they entitled to their own agency, right? Do I treat them like a child and get a parent's permission to interview them? These are going to be pretty case specific, but so if you're interviewing someone who has an intellectual disability or a processing disability, my fiance has a head injury, so he gets very distracted. You minimize distractions, be extra patient, allow extra time, simplify your sentences, clarify.
That's one where you might look at, doing it via email or something, even if you do it as a personal interview too, just to make sure that they have the chance to articulate it in a way that they're comfortable.
Time to understand the questions. Sarah?
I just have one more suggestion with that. If you are meeting someone and they have like a program organizer or a parent or a teacher or something, and they have an intellectual disability, I would simply start the interview off, and I've done this, saying, we're really interested in hearing your voice, and say this to the person with the disability, and make that very clear from the get-go, because it kind of just lets everybody in the room know that's going to be what you're going to try to do. So if another person tries to hop in and answer for them, they're going to know up front you're going to redirect them. And I've had to do that a lot, and it just sets that expectation from the get-go. And it can be a little awkward, but it's better to do it then than later, and say, you know what, I really would like to hear what so-and-so has to say. You know, it's better to do it front.
All right, I see you. Give me 1 second. I'm very aware that we started late and we have 10 minutes more, and there's one more segment we want to cover. So let's get this in. No, go ahead.
I send my questions ahead of time.
Right, so people have time to think them over.
Yeah.
Write out their answers before I ever get there.
Yeah.
If they want.
Right, and that's especially helpful for someone who has like a processing disability or a cognitive disability where they need a little more time to think about what they might want to answer. So we're going to jump really quick and cover one other really particular area here. Kirti, let's talk about, and Loren, this will be you especially, media production and post-production. So in media production,
Yeah.
it's an issue that we have faced many times. What is it that people miss when they're covering people with disabilities?
Well, first of all, they don't ask a lot of questions, and I think it's because they don't want to make assumptions. But by not asking a lot of questions, you are making a lot of assumptions about how people want their wheelchair to be touched, about how they feel about you, like miking them up or taking photos of it. I would recommend everything when it comes to the title, how they define their disability, what you should put on the chyron, what their whole title should be. Ask just a ton of questions, and like they'd rather you ask a lot of questions than not ask a lot of questions and get it wrong.
So I've done a lot of TV interviews, and I've watched camera people. You know, they spend a lot of time fussing, and we have lighting issues, shadow issues. And it's mostly because they're standing up, and they're shooting from way up here, and I'm sitting, because I do. And usually I make my interviewers sit as well, so we're not doing this, right? Because even though I'm a very tall person, this does not look good in your shot, right? Especially if it's staring up into the sun. So Loren, can you talk to us a little about photographing and cameras?
We've
Yeah,
got
but I'll-
some examples up here too.
Yeah,
some
I'll
stuff.
touch on those, but let me touch on one more real quick that's often the most awkward, and this will have to do with people with hand disabilities, and that is the initial handshake.
Yeah.
You know, and I see Gabe up there, so he may have a comment about it because I know
Gabe.
enough about his situation. You know, I have a certain level of hand disability, but others have complete hand disability, or take somebody who's a multiple arm amputee. How do you shake hands?
Yeah, I stuck my hand
It's-
out for
it's-
someone one time, and they didn't have an arm, and I'm sitting there going, I'm an
or
idiot.
a person with a visual who's blind. And like the best thing you can do is just to say, how are we going to get this started? You want, you fist bump, we're going to, pat you on the head, please no.
No.
But,
You don't need to always touch them to
just
start the interview.
recognizing that you don't have the answer. You don't know. And so, Gabe, do you have a quick comment on how you've dealt with that?
I mean, it's never not awkward.
There you go.
A lot of times I always keep my arm on my lap, and so it takes a second or two to get my arm up on the armrest. So by the time they extend their arm for a handshake, there's already a big 3-4 seconds of awkwardness. Like, okay, well, my hand's sitting here in midair and you're not reaching for it. So I've mentally just sort of gotten in the habit of trying to put my arm up before I ever go up to them, so that way I at least lift my hand up a little bit and they sort of get that visual cue to reach out for that arm. If it's an emergency, I'll need to say, hey, just give me a fist bump on my arm or joystick with the controller in it and go from there.
The best one I've ever heard is somebody looked at me realizing it was not quite what they expected, and they're like, how are we going to do this? And that was like, just made it work, and the whole interview worked on. But
Right.
let me turn around to my passion, my thing that really annoys me, and that's what I consider to be pretty lazy photography. The first one is stock photography. Now, if you're in the journalism side, that's probably not used, but in the marketing side, oh boy, sometimes you have to do it, and even Jen and I have plugged our nose and bought a stock photo when it just had to be. But there is good and there is bad stock photography. And the first is recognizing when the person probably does not really belong in a wheelchair. And
I think in that series, there was a man in the wheelchair, and then in the next set, it was his woman companion sitting in the wheelchair, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
But here's one where I hope she doesn't live in that wheelchair, because it's just so obnoxiously big compared to her. And in my mind, you probably could have found a better photo than this one. So is there one more that this? Oh no,
It's not.
No,
It's
and
not
more-
her wheelchair.
It's not
more than
it's
likely-
not the kind of wheelchair where
Can
you
you go
would
back,
like
John?
stay in.
Yeah,
That's
more
a
than
hospital
likely,
wheelchair.
she doesn't even use a wheelchair. It's
No,
the
they-
photographer's daughter, cousin, something like that.
Someone got paid to take pictures of children in wheelchairs. They got a wheelchair, they borrowed it from
Yeah.
somewhere, and they borrowed the kid.
Yeah.
And she
But the-
jumped into it.
But the point is that if you're writing a story about libraries, okay, she's a really cute kid, and that the average reader would probably move on. But for the people with disabilities who see that, we literally blow a gasket, thinking how lazy that was to put that photo in there.
Because it looks like she stole the chair from a hospital
Yeah.
and went to a library.
Right, and she's about to steal the book, yeah.
Little felon.
We want to talk about how you, if you do have to use a stock photo, how to tell, to look at a chair and say, okay, that's an independent living chair. That's
It's-
just the difference between a hospital
Yeah, I think
chair
if you go to the
and
first
an
one.
independent living wheelchair.
Right.
Yeah, go to the last one, then we'll move on. I know.
Yeah.
But this one is more about exactly the same thing as if you were to interview a person in a wheelchair and be hovering over them. That guy is probably not that small, but look at the angle of the photo and imagine if the story was about how he did
It's another
something
hospital
great,
chair, too.
and yet we've made him look so. So anyway, I think there's a lot that can be done with photography as well to make sure that it accurately reflects the story you're trying to tell.
So if you want to take that guy's picture, how do you do it, Loren?
Well, the perspective is the first thing you would look at, is to make sure that you're, same with when you're writing a story or interviewing, is eye to eye is probably the best. And like if I'm trying to tell a story about an athlete, I want them to look bigger than smaller, so I'm getting down low and really low to tell the story. But the same is true if I'm just telling a story about a person who is a PhD or something like that. I'm looking for a perspective that puts them into just a what most consumers would want to read and see and feel like, okay, that's my family member. And that's definitely not it right there, for sure.
And honestly, it's an epiphany moment when I'm being interviewed and I tell the videographer to sit down. You're going to want to get down. Because they're standing there and they're trying to angle the camera, and then they're angling lights and they're trying to make it work, and we're getting shadows and it's not quite working, and they're getting frustrated, and I'm like, you want a chair? If you bring it, it'll work much better.
I mean, like just I know we're behind, but like in an interview, like, I'm sorry, your name right there? Joey. So like, no, stay with the way you were. Like if I am gonna be interviewed and I see Joey sitting like that, I'm relaxed too. If I see him like that, sitting ready to do an interview, sitting down. But if somebody's hovering over me, like we're on deadline here, we gotta go, it totally changes the way the interview goes. You're just not relaxed. And so to me, that body language says, hey, I'm gonna sit down and have a talk with you.
How many of you guys use multimedia or video or audio or do anything like that? Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the principles that you use to get video and to get audio, it applies. It's like the same thing you learned in school, like get down to face level. Make sure you're telling them if you need to touch them in any way, like just say, hey, is it okay if I do this? If you need to maneuver the law around their wheelchair or something, ask them if it's okay. Just like really general stuff that you would do to anyone anyways, but sometimes like we don't think about that when we realize like we need to get down a little bit.
Yeah, so I've used a service dog on and off, and for a long time I used one. So if my service dog is here, please ignore it. Don't interact with it. Don't pet it. Mine used to make adorable photos. And people always wanted photos of the two of us interacting, and that's fine, but it's not your job to pet my dog, talk to my dog. My dog is my tool. It's part of me, and you don't interact with my service animal unless I need it. So Kirti's going to take a look at our notes and figure out where we need to wrap up. But the last thing that I really personally want to say is what's come to me in doing the work I've done and doing some of these kind of workshops in the past is, you know, as kids, we're taught not to stare, right? And by the time we become adults, that becomes don't look, right? So people don't look at us. They don't see us. We become invisible. And so that means that where we keep telling you, just ask me, just ask me a question. My gosh, you're a storyteller, you're a journalist, you're intrusive as hell. Just ask, right? I mean, it's what you do for a living, it's what I do for a living. I ask questions. But people are afraid to ask me these questions. They'll ask me anything else, but they won't ask me these questions. And for the work we're trying to do together, these are the most important questions. So please, I'm asking you, let go of that fear. Thank you very much. Let go of that and just ask, because while I am truly a prickly human being, I really am. Yeah, Amy's going, oh yeah, you guys should see me sober. Oh wait a minute, sorry. You know, I'm in this area. If you come with good intent, I'm going to give you all. My gosh, that's the invitation I've been waiting for. I want to educate you. I want to help you get it right. I want you to not make me look stupid on your pages or on your air. And sometimes that's what you end up doing when you're afraid to ask me. All right, I'm done talking. Kirti?
Let me just add to that one more. I would say we've probably seen 20 interns come through from Cronkite, maybe more.
Yeah, maybe.
And
they're all awesome.
True. But the interesting thing is, of course, we've had average and above average, but the thing is that almost all of them come in so apprehensive to start that first interview with a person with a disability, and you can just see the sweat and the reluctance and the avoidance. And by the time one semester is done, all of them, that part of it is just second nature. That's how in 3 months they got it. The disability part is almost as if they don't notice it. And
We're
Kirti
still
could
teaching them how to
probably-
use a comma, but
Yeah. Yeah, but Kirti might be able to add to that too
Go for it,
in
Kirti.
terms of how it was then and now.
Yeah, I mean, I came in, they know that I don't know everything all the time, forever and ever and ever and ever. So I asked a lot of questions, and it's good that I asked a lot of questions. And even now, like 1 year later, I still ask a ton of questions. Sometimes I repeat the questions I ask. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, they don't expect you to come into an interview and just know, right? So, like, you don't have to hold yourself to that standard. It's okay to ask them. But anyway, let's say that, you know, you finished your interview. You make sure always to ask them what is and is not okay to shoot. Some people have different things that they're just really not comfortable with for a variety of extremely valid reasons. So make sure you let them know, like, hey, I'm going to be shooting. Let me know what I can and can't shoot. And post-production, use the NCDJ style guide. The AP style guide doesn't cover some of the stuff as in-depth when it comes to disability as the NCDJ style guide does. So it's really helpful to use that. We use it a lot. You also want to be careful about using the right words and the disability language you use. So on your chyron, maybe don't say handicapped or wheelchair bound or anything like that, especially like if you're showing their face, then you're saying this kind of stuff in your chyron. And lastly, you want to really think about how your story is going to shape the media landscape in terms of how disability is covered. We don't cover it that often, so every story we have in disability, it's kind of a big deal. So you want to be able to make sure that your audience is getting the correct information in the short amount of time they are exposed to more disability coverage.
So I'm going to wrap it up with one more thing. So this is the largest minority population in the United States, and 1 in 3 people does live with a disability every single day. And as an advocate I've known for a very long time, says if you're fortunate enough to live long enough with 100% certainty, you will experience a disability. Mary, you're living with one right now, right? And it happens, whether it's temporary, whether it's permanent, whether it's, you know, due to age, illness, whatever. Everyone will live with a disability, and everyone knows someone who lives with a disability. We represent 16 billion T&E dollars every year. That's something worth paying attention to. And as Erica pointed out earlier today, when you're doing all of those other issue-based stories, you'll find out that in terms of indices, that disability can be I hate using this, don't ever use it as a quote, but a misery multiplier, right? So if unemployment is X, it is this much higher in the disability community. You know, if violence, more than half of deaths from police use of violence happen to people with disabilities. The Arizona Department of Corrections is the largest supplier of mental health services in our state. You know, these are things that people don't look at when they're looking for stories. So almost every story you have, and that's what we tell interns when they come in, whatever story, you tell me the story you want to tell and I'll tell you what your disability angle is to it. Because every story you want to tell has a disability angle. So if you go into your newsroom with a pitch and it's the over-reported, you know, the year of the woman, the year of the woman, the year of the woman, right? The year of the woman. But no one's talking about the disabled woman, right? Whatever your story is, the over-reported story has an under-reported angle to it. That is probably the disability angle. And it has a wider appeal than most people recognize. Because, again, everyone knows someone that lives with a disability.
I'm good. Thank you all.